The room was carved from white marble and filled with gold trim. Inside the Riyadh Economic Summit, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sat beneath a banner that read, "Unity through investment." At his right, CEOs from Europe. At his left, oil billionaires from the Gulf. Across from him, Ibrahim Traoré. Silent. Observing. MBS leaned forward, voice calm but commanding. Africa is the future. But the future needs guidance. Vision. Leadership. We can help your continent rise, if you follow our model. The room hummed with polite nods. Cameras flashed. But Traoré didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply said, "Did Africa ask to be led?" That stopped everything. MBS's mouth tightened. "Brother," he said, trying to recover, "we are not colonizers. We are partners. You will benefit from our stability, our networks, our capital." But Traoré cut in, still calm. "You speak of capital. I speak of dignity. You call it leadership. I call it intrusion." Tension thickened. The moderator tried to shift topics. The panel moved on. But the story had already broken. Within hours, hashtags flooded the internet. Hashtag Africa leads itself. Hashtag no more kings. Hashtag Traoré versus the throne. In Burkina Faso, students painted murals of a lion facing a golden throne, with the words, "We follow no crown." In Riyadh, MBS's advisors met behind closed doors. "He embarrassed the crown," one whispered. "On our soil," another added. But Traoré wasn't playing by royal rules. He had come not to ask, but to assert. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, headlines swirled from Paris to Pretoria. Burkina Faso's Traoré confronts Saudi prince on live stage. A new voice from the Sahel, is Traoré the anti-establishment lion? In Riyadh, MBS didn't react publicly. But behind the palace gates, he wasn't pleased. He summoned his strategic council, businessmen, diplomats, and security advisors. The room was tense. "The man is reckless," said one advisor. "No," MBS replied coolly. "He's deliberate." That afternoon, a private invitation was delivered to Traoré's suite. No press. No cameras. Just a location, the Royal Desert Tent. A symbol of ancient power, diplomacy, and subtle dominance. When Traoré arrived, MBS greeted him without ceremony. No titles. No translators. "You embarrassed me," MBS said flatly. "I exposed a misunderstanding," Traoré replied. They sat across a low table. Tea was served, untouched. MBS leaned forward. "I don't want to conquer Africa. I want to invest in it. We built Niam in the desert, we can help build your future." Traoré smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You paved your desert with dreams. We till ours with survival. Africa doesn't need a savior. It needs a chance, on its own terms." The silence was heavier than the heat outside. MBS tried one more line. "Then let us lead together." Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply said, "If leadership must be shared, it must first be surrendered. And I see no crown that's willing." He left the tent with no handshake. And that night, across African social media, a quote from Traoré echoed. "You can't invest in freedom if you still expect obedience." The desert had heard his voice. And it would not forget it. In the weeks that followed the summit, Riyadh's outreach machine shifted into overdrive. Leaked memos revealed a coordinated effort to soften the backlash. A $1.2 billion infrastructure proposal for West African rail lines. A scholarship fund aimed at African engineering students. And most notably, an energy alliance, offer to partner with Burkina Faso on solar and lithium extraction. But Traoré didn't take the bait. He issued a single statement. Our future will not be built by those who think in numbers, but by those who remember what was taken. This wasn't politics anymore. It was posture. And it was shaking alliances. Inside the Gulf, whispers began circulating among mid-level royal advisors. Why is Traoré a problem now? He's small-scale. Why give him oxygen? But oil ministers knew better. Traoré had just announced a multi-country resource pact, linking Burkina Faso with Mali, Guinea, and Niger. No Western intermediaries. No Gulf sponsorship. And at the center of it? A bold clause. All extraction contracts will be subject to landholder approval. It was revolutionary. It bypassed ministries. It bypassed foreign banks. It handed power back to the villagers, to the ground itself. MBS watched from Riyadh as key Gulf-funded projects in Africa quietly stalled. Local communities were pushing back, citing Traoré's language. A new phrase entered the international development world. The Sahel Doctrine. One analyst from the World Economic Forum wrote, "It's not anti-capitalist. It's post-imperial." And in that framing, MBS saw the threat. Because this wasn't just a rejection of Gulf money. It was the beginning of an alternative legitimacy, one the petrodollar couldn't buy. Months passed. The Gulf's media tried to paint Traoré as unstable, an idealist without infrastructure. But something strange happened. Every attack backfired. In Senegal, protesters held signs reading, "Unstable?" or "Untouchable." In Ghana, students debated leadership versus ownership, Traoré's distinction. And in Burkina Faso, something even more serious began. A resource audit conducted by villagers, not bureaucrats. Instead of waiting for foreign geologists, local elders and engineers mapped where the lithium, uranium, and gold deposits ran. They shared their data publicly. Not for investors. For leverage. MBS saw what was coming before most did. This wasn't just nationalism. It was grassroots governance. The kind that couldn't be bribed, bullied, or bought. In response, Saudi envoys offered Traoré's administration a $400 million joint development deal. It included roads, schools, energy grids. But buried on page 6 of the contract? A clause granting Saudi Arabia priority export rights for any discovered rare minerals for 20 years. Traoré circled it in red ink and returned the contract, unsigned, with a single note. If our ground feeds your future, it must first feed our children. The crown didn't like being told no. But the desert winds were shifting. MBS's inner circle debated retaliation, cutting aid, freezing trade, pulling diplomatic support. But there was hesitation. Because punishing Traoré now would confirm everything he'd been saying. That leadership offered with strings wasn't leadership at all. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou to a crowd waiting in the rain. No fanfare. No red carpet. Just villagers. Miners. Students. One young girl handed him a small notebook with a sketch, a broken chain, replaced by roots. Underneath, she had written, "We are not rebuilding. We are rerouting." The message spread faster than any press release. Meanwhile, in Riyadh, MBS's silence became its own signal. He didn't respond to the rejection. He didn't send another envoy. But what he did do, was instruct the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund to pause all new investment in West Africa. The pause was quiet. Strategic. Meant to starve momentum without looking aggressive. But Traoré already knew. That night, he walked into a televised town hall and spoke with no script. "We have had decades of foreign money. But what we lacked, was foreign humility. If investment ends because we dare to decide for ourselves, then it was never partnership. It was permission. And we no longer ask for permission. The video went viral. Even in parts of the Middle East. A Saudi professor posted the clip with a surprising comment. Traoré isn't anti-Gulf. He's anti-condescension. That hit hard. Because the quiet truth was emerging. MBS wasn't losing to a military alliance. He was losing to a narrative he couldn't control. And in the palace, someone finally said it. We thought we were offering leadership. But we were delivering it in a crown. And they've stopped kneeling. The International Banking Summit in Geneva had nothing to do with Africa, at least on paper. But Traoré's name came up 5 minutes into the opening keynote. A European analyst joked. We used to worry about China and Russia. Now we're worried about Burkina Faso? The audience laughed, until the moderator replied. You're not worried about the country. You're worried about the idea. The room fell quiet. Because they knew what he meant. Traoré hadn't raised an army. He had raised doubt, in the legitimacy of foreign direction, in the morality of extraction-based deals, in the language of development. MBS watched the shift from a distance. He called for a private roundtable, 6 diplomats, 3 economic advisors, and a PR strategist. We need to reframe Traoré, he said. Not attack, reposition. Make him look isolationist. Make him look unstable. But the strategist shook her head. We tried. The problem is, he's not yelling. He's not threatening. He's teaching. And people are listening. It wasn't about Burkina Faso's GDP anymore. It was about authority fatigue. Around the world, from Nairobi to New Delhi, young leaders were quoting Traoré. Not just his policies, but his posture. Africa doesn't need alignment. It needs alignment with itself. We're not anti-global. We're anti-surrender. Back in Riyadh, MBS walked alone in the royal garden. He passed the marble statue built in his honor. It stood tall. Solid. Unmoving. And yet, for the first time, it felt like the only thing standing still. It was supposed to be off the record. A closed-door development conference hosted by the World Bank, featuring African heads of state, Western diplomats, and select Gulf representatives. Traoré wasn't even on the original speaker list. But when a panelist from France began outlining a new, Pan-African infrastructure framework, she described it as a pathway for modern leadership to follow. That's when Traoré stood up, quietly. No microphone. No slides. Just his voice. With all due respect, he began, Africa does not follow. It remembers. It rebuilds. And most importantly, it redefines. He didn't raise his tone, but the room froze. We've been asked to follow blueprints drawn on foreign desks. But those blueprints never showed the damage done. Only the profits gained. Someone began recording. If leadership means leading us back into dependence, then perhaps we should walk without you. Not in anger, but in clarity. When he finished, there was no applause. Only stillness. But the video leaked. And within 24 hours, it had 60 million views. Young people across Africa stitched his words into music. Activists in South America and Southeast Asia quoted him in posters. Walk without them. Not in anger, but in clarity. In Riyadh, MBS watched the clip on his tablet. Alone. He didn't speak. Because somewhere deep beneath the crown, he understood. Power without resonance is just noise. And Traoré was echoing. In a symbolic move, Traoré announced that a former colonial military base, used for over 5 decades by foreign advisors, would be converted into a public university focused on resource sovereignty and civic engineering. The opening ceremony was modest. No lavish displays. Just students, villagers, and one powerful gesture. An old, faded Saudi flag, once flown during joint military exercises, was folded and handed back to Riyadh's regional attaché. No anger. No spectacle. Just one sentence spoken by Traoré. We thank those who stood beside us. But we now stand on our own. The attaché nodded, tight-lipped. Cameras rolled. Within hours, Gulf outlets called it a deeply disrespectful gesture. But in Africa? The image went viral. A still photo. Traoré handing over the flag with calm hands, surrounded by students holding books instead of rifles. Underneath, a new phrase was born. Return the flags. Raise the minds. MBS held an emergency media briefing that night. He called for renewed cooperation with the African continent and warned of emerging nationalist postures that may hurt development. But no one missed the subtext. He was talking about one man. And the more he spoke of partnership, the more it sounded like possession. Traoré, meanwhile, didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. Because when a small country returns a powerful man's symbol, without fear, without anger, without apology, it says more than 1,000 speeches ever could. And that silence? It traveled further than oil pipelines ever had. The pressure was mounting, not just in Africa, but within MBS's own camp. Economic advisors warned. We're losing ground, not in markets, but in meaning. So MBS made one final move. A personal envoy flew to Ouagadougou with a sealed letter. Inside, a proposal to host a joint Gulf African Leadership Summit, with Traoré as keynote speaker, a custom-built investment package tailored for the Sahel, and a symbolic invitation to co-author a new doctrine of development. On the surface, it looked like respect. But the details told another story. Page 12 listed core governance expectations. Page 14 outlined shared communication strategies. And the final page? A clause requiring Traoré to publicly reaffirm regional alignment with Gulf vision. Traoré read the entire letter in silence. Then he asked a staffer to bring him something. Not a pen. Not a response. A mirror. He placed the mirror on the desk, angled it toward the letter, and quietly said, "If they want to see leadership, they should look at themselves. If they want obedience, they should send it elsewhere." He returned the envelope with no additions. And that afternoon, he visited a village school being rebuilt by local hands, funded by community gold, not foreign aid. There, a child asked him, "Why don't they like what you're doing?" Traoré knelt, smiled, and replied, "Because I don't ask them how to be me." The footage aired on local TV, but within hours, it crossed oceans. That single moment, a leader not behind a podium, but beside a child, spoke louder than any summit ever could. And MBS? He finally understood. He had tried to lead Africa by commanding its steps. Traoré was leading it by letting it walk. Months later, at the Future Global Forum in Singapore, leaders from every continent gathered to discuss the next economic chapter of the developing world. MBS was scheduled to speak last, centerpiece of the night. But the room wasn't waiting for him. Because earlier that day, Ibrahim Traoré gave an impromptu talk in a breakout session. No press. No formal invite. Just one chair, a low mic, and a circle of emerging nation delegates sitting on the floor around him. He didn't pitch proposals. He didn't flash slides. He told a story. "A man once offered to show us the stars," he began. "He wore gold and walked tall. But every time he pointed upward, his feet crushed our soil. So we stopped looking where he pointed. And started planting what he stepped on." The room didn't applaud. They just listened. And when MBS eventually took the main stage, he noticed something odd. A third of the audience had left. Those who stayed weren't clapping like before. They were watching, measuring, thinking. Because in that space, the shine of a crown didn't feel like vision anymore. It felt like resistance to change. Later that night, a journalist asked Traoré if he considered himself a rival to the Gulf leadership. He smiled. "I'm not a rival. I'm a reminder. That no one leads a people, not forever, unless they walk beside them." The clip went viral. And back in Riyadh, in the quiet of his marble study, MBS stared at a world map carved into the wall. A golden pin once marked every Gulf-backed project in Africa. But now, some pins had been removed. Not by war. Not by revolution. But by dignity. Sometimes, power isn't taken, it's returned. Not with weapons. Not with protests. But with presence. Ibrahim Traoré didn't raise his voice to silence a prince. He simply stood his ground, and reminded the world that leadership isn't something you declare. It's something earned, by walking beside your people, not ahead of them. MBS came with offers. With vision. With legacy. But Traoré came with one thing more powerful than gold or oil. A people who remembered how to lead themselves. And once they remembered, no one could ever speak for them again.